Hi, everybody. It looks like maybe we're going to have a smaller group today because we don't have a huge agenda, but thank you to everybody who came. Hi, Janice. I was thinking, I wanted to just start off with, did everyone get the email from NCSL about the research, the legislative kind of search they did, potentially related to biochar? Okay. And I apologize for keep using the same email over and over because IT still hasn't given me permission to create a Google Drive that includes people from outside of state government. So instead of reinventing it every single time, I just keep going back to the original email. So my apologies. I don't know if any folks had any thoughts about that. Brooke, I think Al is doing research. Is it Al who's doing the legislative research? So I'm hoping that's going to give him a good jump start or a kick start. And I know that it just got sent yesterday. So if folks want time to take a look at that and give some feedback to CSU next time, we can do that. I don't know if anyone was familiar with any of those bills and think that they're helpful for CSU to look at. Or if you want some time to think about it, and if you want me to put it back on the agenda for the 30th. Or do you just want CSU to go for it?
Personally, I still need to review.
Okay, so I'll put it back on the agenda for next week. Take a peek at it, see if any of it looks relevant to you. And then Brooke, maybe that gives Al some time too to kind of give his thoughts about what he thinks about that list and what he's working on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I will send that over and make sure he's received that email and let him know it's on the agenda for next time.
Great. All right, I need to make a little note to myself that's on the agenda for next time. And then, Brooke, I think you're the last woman standing here from CSU. Do you want to just check in a little bit about how you all are doing? Do you need guidance on anything? Are you guys feeling stuck on anything?
I think we're moving along well. We've hired personnel. I have a little update from Thomas. We've hired personnel for the project. We've started literature review for the biochar and cement, the biochar with produced water, and the biochar plus greenhouse gases. We've identified potential biochar sources for laboratory testing and develop a research approach and experimental design for those testing, and then started the TEA analysis. Within the TEA analysis on my side, I've engaged in discussions with biochar producers to understand the different operating aspects of a well and the typical costs and procedures and material inputs for the well. We've talked with some well plugging operators, and then I've also been analyzing data from the COGC website. With every well that's plugged and abandoned, there's a well abandonment report. So that's been really helpful with my economic analysis. And then with direction heading, concluding that economic analysis, the laboratory test data that's going to be done is going to be an important aspect of that economic analysis, as we want to make sure that the amount of biochar that's going in the cement and the amount of biochar that's going in the spacer is accurate within the economic analysis. So the results from the laboratory test data will be important with that aspect. And then I'm going to start integrating the energy and material balances from the economic analysis into the environmental impact analysis. I've done some work on that already without biochar, and as you can imagine, the cement is the primary contributor to the greenhouse gas emissions. Back to Thomas's update, we've established contact with NREL for a potential partnership, and then we're on schedule to produce an unofficial progress report on March 1st. Right now, with our deadlines, we have the March 1st unofficial progress report, and then the official report due on June 1st. And then August 1st, we have the recommendations for the pilot program, which is going to include estimated costs, durations, detailed plan for implementation, opportunities for funding and the process for reporting findings. And then we also have the deadline of December 1st, which is the draft report describing recommendations for the development of the pilot program. And then finally, that final report due December 15th. So those are the updates I have from Thomas.
Great. Let's see. I'm wondering if Michelle is not available in person. That's why she's chatting. Let me look.
I'm here. I'm trying to not be disruptive.
Okay. Hi, Michelle.
I
So Brooke, do you see that in the chat, sorry, Brooke, you can speak for yourself. Do you want to add your thoughts about your biochar and equity report? And then Brooke, maybe your thoughts about Michelle's comment?
I haven't had a chance to review that. I see she just sent it over, but I'll definitely take a look at what she sent over and see if it has any impact on the analysis.
Great. Michelle, is there anything in particular you'd like Brooke to think about?
Thank you. Yeah, it just often equity comes in at the end of a project. And so reviewing this is a good way to start bringing it in from the beginning, and may have some good, even if they're just general bullet points of, you know, here might be some good practices, best practices to ensure that biochar is equitable and communities are being engaged before these projects are being imposed on them, so they can be more partners.
Brooke, do you want to take a look at Michelle's report, and then if you have questions or some thoughts, or you're kind of stumped about how to maybe try to incorporate some equity and environmental justice principles into your research, do you mind connecting with Michelle? She has, I think, a lot of good ideas, just making sure that we're tackling some of those things on the front end as we're making recommendations.
Yeah, certainly. I can reach out to you, Michelle, after I've given it a read.
That sounds good. I'm happy to meet.
Awesome.
One of the things I'll toss out real quick is I don't know if citing of actually facilities is going to be within our scope, but we'll definitely look at what you've presented here and see if any of the points apply. If there are areas where you think that we should include these specific things as a part of the work, please let us, help us out, right? Throw us a bone.
Jason, could you, I'm not sure I understood your comment. I apologize. Could you rephrase maybe?
Sure. So I haven't read the article. Like I said, it just posted up. So is this, Michelle, why don't you give us like the 10-second overview of the 35 pages?
Okay. I do get asked to do that somewhat frequently. What is the 10-second equity bite?
What's your elevator speech?
Yeah, essentially that even when something could be a good climate solution or environmental solution, communities need to be engaged to ensure that the solution fits for their specific location and their specific community that they want it, and that we're being clear about who is benefiting from the solution, and if anyone is paying in any way, in what ways they're paying. So if there's burdens attached to it, making sure that we're clear and not just placing environmental burdens on frontline communities. I tried to make it very visual, actually. So there's some good spots that you could probably just skim through it and get, still get some good, get a good overview out of it. I also went over some of the pros and cons in terms of biochar, and just that, going into this project, I'd really only heard and seen pros of biochar, and in speaking with communities, learned that there's actually some risks that need to be thought about as well. So it is mostly on siting and the facilities of biochar more than does biochar work or not, but you'll see there's also a video of a scientist who is essentially saying that biochar does not provide a lot of the benefits that people claim it does. And that was another finding that I found, is just in trying to review the literature. Brooke, I wonder if you found this. There's just one paper that says this is why it sequesters carbon, another paper that says this is why it does not sequester carbon. So it's also another good, I think that also speaks to what I mentioned before, that biochar is actually many different things, and it's sort of difficult to treat it as though it's one thing, and there's different types of biochar and they work in different ways. So it also speaks to that, which may have some consequence for this project as well. How's that for a brief overview?
That's perfect. I think that latter part is definitely relevant to the work we're doing. I think the citing of actual facilities is outside the scope of what we're looking at right now. But yeah, that's perfect. We'll have a quick look at it. Thanks.
Oh. I think, Jason, it might be appropriate as we're making recommendations as an advisory group and as CSU is making recommendations and we're thinking about a potential pilot project. I think it would be important for the advisory group to include, we want environmental justice and equity ideas represented as part of the pilot. Where would we maybe potentially look at wells for plugging and what are the pros and the cons? And I think I've heard in other conversations where the biochar comes from might also be an important consideration, what communities might be affected, things like that. So I think there are maybe some principles that we could include in our whatever our recommendations are, so that if we do recommend a pilot project, we're making sure that some of that lens has been applied to our recommendations. Does that sound fair?
I agree. Yeah.
Great. And then Brooke and Michelle, do you want me to just put this as a parking lot thing for a future check-in with the group?
I can just reach out to her via email to get her feedback on
Okay. I didn't
using the
want to
report or how
report back
she
to the
sees
group,
it.
Brooke, or at a future check-in, you can just let us know kind of how you and Michelle
Sure.
consulted.
Yeah, I like that. I think that'd be good, since it's something that can be hard for people to wrap their minds around, so we could report back as to how our conversation goes.
Okay. I don't have much more. I just wanted to make sure we were checking in, and I just wanted to make sure, CSU, that you felt like you had the support from this group that you need at this point in time. So again, to the group, I have another meeting slated for the 30th. I'm going to work on a Zoom again today. Hopefully you're all going to get the actual link by the end of the day today. Sorry, Zoom is like my nemesis. And I have invited Lori to that meeting. Are there any specific questions that you all have for Lori? I think her expertise is biochar and cement and the integrity of cement, I think. And I took a gander at the YouTube that Kathleen sent at one of our previous meetings. Hold on, Stephen, I'll circle back around to you so you can speak. Sorry, I'm sorry, Stephen, you had your hand up. Do you want to
That's
talk?
okay, I can wait. I put it in the chat. Go ahead and finish your thought.
Okay. Are there questions that you all would like Lori to address, or things that you think she can or should address? Some of you, I think, already know her and of her work. That would be good for the advisory group and or for CSU.
It's Thomas Borg here. So I was trying to get in on this Google Meet for 10 minutes. That's why I'm first joining now. That's all I got on my calendar, so I apologize for that. We had a meeting with NRAW, with Anna O'Day and Mike Griffin. I don't know if Brooke already told you guys about that meeting.
She let us know that you had a meeting, but not maybe what you all did.
Well, did you summarize anything from that meeting or not?
I presented the slides you had given me for the last meeting, just the CSU update. I discussed that.
Okay, so it was just one interesting take home from that meeting we had with Anna and Mike, and that is, that based on all their research, you cannot substitute cement with biochar, but you can use biochar as a potential filler material. I don't know if that's the right terminology. Was that what they were calling it, Brooke? Filler?
You mean like as an ingredient?
Yeah.
An aggregate.
Aggregate.
An aggregate.
Yes.
An aggregate. I think it's just important that we don't think about it, because I did, as you you just put some biochar in with a concrete and you're fine. No, so you have to think about it as an aggregate and not as a substitute for cement in general. So that was quite interesting. And yeah, we had an hour-long great conversation with a lot of good feedback that we are incorporating into our experimental design going forward. And we will also be doing some mechanical strength testing, both at CSU and at NROL. They have a nice setup there that they have allowed us to use. And I think they also bring up, if I recall correctly, that if one were to suddenly use cement where you have biochar as an aggregate instead of just, you know, Portland cement, that would be potentially a lot of need for changes in I don't know, in approval process for this type of cement or regulations. And it's probably something that maybe Dave Andrews could speak to, you know, that is not so straightforward, you know. He might be kicking back, you know, before an extensive line of testing has been done to prove that it can actually be done. And obviously that could be a part of a pilot testing, but that was kind of my take home from that meeting. But they did indicate that it had some success with using biochar as an aggregate up to about whatever 20-25%. I don't know.
That seems high. But I just want to follow up on some of your comments, Tom, because I actually, when I was in Switzerland a month or two ago, visited a company that's putting biochar in concrete. I tried to connect you to them. I think we should still have that conversation. But there's also a company in Oregon that was in the webinar that I shared with everybody, Solid Carbon. They've done extensive testing of all different kinds of biochars, of all different kinds of recipes. So I would just say, don't try to reinvent the wheel, because there's been an awful lot of experimentation done and testing. So for me, a lot of it comes down to cost benefit analysis and the way it's being done in the US. You'll see in that webinar, the first question I asked him is, you know, how much does the biochar have to cost for this to make economic sense? And it was super cheap. And the economics are extremely different in Europe for a variety of reasons. So I think it's important to, when you're selecting the biochars, understand the cost of it, because some of the variable price right now is between $0 and $1,000. And then the other impact is, do you get the credits? Do you want the credits? Because sometimes they're coupled and sometimes they're decoupled. So these are things that you need to be aware of. But in terms of regulatory, it is a big question. I've spoken to folks in the cement industry, and it's not approved. It'll take a long time for them to incorporate that into their ASTM standards. But what some people are doing is, I see the comment about fly ash. The issue with fly ash is that they want the older fly ash before the Clean Air Act, because the heavy metals are in the newer fly ash. So the amount of fly ash available as an aggregate for the cement industry is diminishing quickly. So there are folks that are carbonizing things like sewage sludge and deliberately keeping the carbon content really low so that it can be called fly ash, but we would almost call it biochar. So anyway, just a couple of things for you to be aware of.
Well, that's great. That's great input. Yeah, and I know Nicholas Hagemann very well since he was a student. You know, I was actually in his committee, so it's easy to connect with. It's the Itaha Institute or whatever they call it.
Yeah, I'm part of it, so I know Nicholas well. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a great guy. So that's great, because that type of input is, I think Holly's on here. She's developing the experimental plan for the biochar cement part of the project. And obviously, to have all that information before we design any types of experiments is extremely important. I don't think we have directly found a lot of papers on this direct subject, but Holly can probably speak to that.
Well, and the other person you should speak to about that is who spoke to the Colorado State Legislature, Harn Waikua, if you don't know him already. He's on the IBI board with me, and he's done the most. He's got a PhD from MIT in material science, and he's been doing this for 10 years. So he's a great contact, very well steeped in this subject.
Good to know.
Okay, so I just want to point out that Stephen has some good points about back. So I'm going to go back a little bit, make sure we cover things that people raise their hands about. Brooke, I think there's a couple more resources that Stephen posted that we can take a look at to apply environmental justice lens. So I want to make sure that that got recognized. Kathleen, if you have a contact in Finland, it sounds like Amanda is traveling there with OEdit. And
I have tons, Amanda. I led a study tour there a couple of years ago and we had over 100 people. So I'll follow up with you directly on that.
Okay. And
I
then
want to revisit the equity side of things. I think it's important here is that the work we're doing is not about locations for siting and all of these other things. And so I do a lot of work in electrified transportation. I do a lot of work in equity. I understand how important that is and how it's been very marginalized in the past. And so I want to acknowledge that. But the work we're doing is not about citing specific locations, right? And so, again, I think this group in a recommendation should include these resources and this summary in terms of if a pilot goes forward, these are the things that need to be considered. But anyway, I just kind of want to be very transparent about that, is that we're looking at some very specific things, and citing of a pilot plant location is really outside the scope of what we're doing, if that makes sense. So open to comments on that. Thanks.
Let me just jump in a little bit that it is overall about citing. That's why I was asked to do the report, but really it goes over some of the pros and cons of biochar with communities. So I think it still has some benefits. And I just, communities again and again and again asked to be a part of these decision-making processes. And that's really at the heart of all this, is communities need to be a part of it. So
100% agree with you, Michelle. And I think that's the next step. After this work, then that's when communities would start to be engaged. Because I think our job here, if I were to summarize it very, very briefly, is like go, no go, right? Like, I think that's what we're about, is go, no go. And if it's a go, then it's to those next steps of like, all right, well, equity and Jesty, locations of these, which wells get plugged, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? I think we're just kind of here on the, does it make sense or not side of the fence.
Yeah, I think it broadens it to be a little bit more holistic. Like, I'm going to read some of the potential risks claimed in the report. People having discussed risks of fire, risk of smoke, risk of mismanagement. So there, ecological concerns, need for more research, which is partly why we're all here. So just speaking to, it is also about how is the biochar made? Where is it made? And I think that does matter in our go or no go decisions.
I don't think we have a way right now through our work to quantify those things that you just talked about. Our focus in terms of environmental impact is greenhouse gas accounting and looking at sequestration of carbon. And there are other metrics, right? So like human health impacts and those things, but currently those are outside the scope because those are really geographically centered, right? The location of those emissions, the populations that live in those emissions. And so I want to acknowledge, I 100% think you're right? And I think that all the things you're talking about are important. I just want to keep coming back to be transparent with this group, right? Because that's why we're here having this discussion, is that some of the things we're talking about right here, right now, while they are important, are currently would lump into the next phase of work and would require different experts in order to truly give those topics the due diligence that they need.
So are you proposing that we don't look at this until the next phase? Or like I don't meet with, was it Brooke?
We're happy to have the conversations. I think the point is that outside of that, we don't have a way to quantify some of the specifics that you're alluding to as a part of the current scope, or the expertise on the team to do some of the things you're talking about, right? So I do a lot of what you're talking about in the electrified transportation sector, and that requires GIS, that requires a variety of other environmental impact categories to be quantified. And so right now that currently doesn't fall within the scope. Does that make sense?
Well, actually, it leaves me a little bit confused, just because, again, if we're looking to plug oil and gas wells for environmental benefit, and we're looking at something that it turns out is being made in a way that it doesn't provide environmental benefit and also causes community harms, then I think it does I think that those things overlap. So yeah, I
I-
still
Yep,
see it.
I agree with you, but I think that what you're talking about is where the actual biochar facility is located, right?
Where and how with
Yep.
what?
Yep, 100% agree with
So
all of those things,
and
right?
I'm naming it in part because people will say biochar. What I'm saying is biochar is a million different things. What is it made of? How is it being made? And we don't have to have strong recommendations about it needs to be made with, you know, pine beetle kill wood in these locations, but we need to have a sense. I think that we need to have a sense of those things. And I don't, you know, I think this is, you know, I was asked to come and represent underrepresented and disinvested communities in this group. And I feel like we're starting to get into how those, like, this is pretty classic for us to not quite know how these things fit in together, and for one group of people to be like, wait, it's important in every step of everything, and another group to be like, we don't understand how it fits in. So I just want to say that too, we're starting to get into this classic bind, but this is what I was asked to join this group for.
So just this, yeah, so based on the House bill, there are very specific objectives that CSU is funded to help out with. And I think that's what Jason is getting at. The first phase, it's just the first of potentially several phases. We're just trying to basically do a feasibility testing. That's basically what it is. Is it feasible to even think about using biochar in the way it has been proposed? Is it technically feasible? Is it practically feasible? Is it economically feasible? Right? And then if we say, yeah, it actually works, you know, we can store some carbon in these wells. Yes, we can use biochar as an aggregate. Then that very, very tiny project is basically, you know, coming to some conclusions next year already. If the conclusions seem to be recommending that we should go to phase 2, where we now consider many more aspects, including, you know, the potential impact on communities and so forth, then it's up to, I guess, the state to determine whether they're interested in funding an expansion of that project to include all these other extremely important topics, you know. But I see this as the first small feasibility study that we are hired to do. And then it's just the beginning potentially. Or maybe if it's not feasible, it doesn't even matter to start invest a lot of money in answering all these other questions, right? That's my understanding, but maybe Karen can,
Yeah.
you know, correct me
Okay,
if I'm
so
wrong.
yeah, thanks, Thomas. So I see that Carmia, so if your comments are still about kind of honoring the fact that we have folks that were specifically put on this advisory group to represent and ensure that we have an environmental justice lens apply to the work that we're doing. Carmia, if you have a comment about that, and then Stephen, I have some thoughts about how we may be able to wrap up and maybe help move on and make sure that we're honoring the fact that people have been assigned to this group for this specific purpose, and making sure that we're honoring what we're trying to do as a group here.
So good morning, everyone. I was unable to attend the last meeting, and I just was able to jump in a few minutes ago on this one. So I may have missed some things, but based on what I'm hearing, I think that what everybody's saying is valid. We are at the feasibility stage. So having a lot of discussions about potential impacts to vulnerable communities or things like that. It may be a little early, but I think with the feasibility comes identifying potential issues for communities, for you know, human health and safety, all of those factors. So I think we do need to be jotting those down and having those discussions as we identify whether or not this is even feasible. And as we learn more and more things, because we don't even have all of the data before us to be informed about what the potential issues might be. So that's my feedback. I think we can continue moving forward. We just need to be taking notes.
Thanks, Carmi. I think those are good points. Stephen, you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Carmia. I think those are excellent points. You know, the fact that part of the feasibility assessment, you know, should necessarily include consideration for potential environmental impacts, because we frankly don't know at this point whether we're going to be funded for a phase two. To Karen and Michelle's point, you know, two of us were included on this in this work group specifically to elevate the considerations of disproportionately impacted communities, because oftentimes when these siting issues go, this is kind of where things end up. So it does need to be incorporated from the beginning. I think that we have the potential for, you know, kind of siloing a bit the academic go no go side of things. The feasibility study, I think there are very real deadlines and very real goals outlined in the legislature for as far as the deliverables and the pressure that's on folks from CSU, and we want to be mindful and respectful of that as well. But I think that the recommendation component, it is critical to have the input for this consideration for things to move forward. So we can have in my mind, a go, no go academic review, but the critical second component of that is, you know, these additional considerations prior to, because it seems like we are on a mission to fast track this stuff. And this is where EJ often slips through the cracks. And I think that's what Michelle is speaking to. So I think that it's not something to necessarily completely derail the academic component, but I think it becomes critical when it comes time to the recommendation that we are looking at these larger issues.
I just want to say I fully agree, and maybe that's a great opportunity for Michelle and her team to chime in, you know, as we get closer to the end, right? We're like, okay, you know, the CSU team says this seems like being a feasible option, and then going forward to a pilot, we definitely need to include all of these other aspects, because it's the only way we can be successful. So I totally agree that Michelle should be a part of everything she has the capacity to be a part of, with respect to recommend and suggest what needs to be considered for a pilot. 100% agree.
Okay. So I think what I'm hearing from the group, hopefully mostly consensus, is we have this research component. There are deadlines to it. There are very specific deliverables that we want to make sure that we are meeting expectations and meeting deadlines. As we start thinking about the go, no go, we want to make sure that if a recommendation says, yes, this is something we should consider for a pilot, that we are including things that we want to be included for environmental justice and disproportionately impacted communities, to make sure that whatever pilot we come up with has that lens applied to it. Am I appropriately summarizing what I think I'm hearing from folks? Okay, great. And so I still think it's valid, Brooke, for you and Michelle to kind of connect, and so that we all like know what the end goal is, like what we're going to think about as we get to a final recommendation and what the report will include. Is that fair?
I can certainly give it a read, and maybe another suggestion would be, like, towards the end, Michelle could give a presentation on environmental justice and how she sees it fitting into biochar. So that way we can all think about that as we're moving forward into that recommendations for the pilot study.
I think that's maybe something that Stephen and Michelle could put their heads together before. I just want to encourage everybody to remember the presentation that they gave about EJ, disproportionately impacted communities, and how our work can include that lens as we do it. So if we need something more than that, let's put that in the parking lot for now and think about what more folks need from that conversation. I wanted to switch back to, while we have our federal partners here and Dave here, this conversation about what questions we might have if biochar is an aggregate to cement. I don't know if I'm saying this right, Thomas. And what things from the federal perspective and or the state's perspective they want to make sure are answered before we're like, yeah, let's just start adding it to cement and using it in our plugging activities. I know we've kind of brushed on this discussion before, but I want to make sure that we're hearing from both our state and federal folks.
So
Okay, so
I'll jump
Kathleen,
in.
I think, so for me, sorry, this is for Karen. My understanding is that we use cement when we plug, not concrete. And so, so I want to make sure that I'm understanding appropriately if we're adding this as an ingredient to cement or to concrete, and that there is a distinction between concrete and cement. Can we start there, please?
Yes. Wells are not plugged with concrete. Wells are plugged in most cases with neat cement, which is Portland G mixed, well, it's to an API standard, not an ASTM standard in most cases. So it's Portland G to an API standard with no additives. You have to realize that the cement gets pumped down thousands of feet through a very, small steel tube. So we can't have sand and aggregate and everything else traveling down that pipe to place the cement where it needs to go. Any additives that are in the cement are usually, they would be ground up. So if biochar was to be used and, cement as an additive, it would have to be, ground up to a point where it can be pumped as a slurry along with the cement. And I'd love to hear more from Mike Wardinsky or anyone from BLM on that point.
Well, that's what we heard too, that you basically, it seems like, you have to powderize the biochar basically, doesn't make it work. One of the questions, now we have a date here. So we do understand that we are in many cases, that first cement plot will be maybe at 7,000 feet depth. Can you talk to us about, so you're mixing it, are you mixing the cement at 7,000 feet? Are you mixing it above, or how? There's some technicality here, that we need to understand, I think, that I didn't fully grasp when we talked to Enroll.
It's mixed with equipment at surface.
And then you just pump it down and it becomes hard.
Yes.
So good morning, everyone. This is Matthew Warren. I'm the acting deputy division chief for the fluid minerals program within BLM. And yeah, like what Dave has been saying simplistically, but for a little more detail, when we go to pump cement down the hole, and we are using cement, we don't generally use aggregate, but it doesn't mean we won't use aggregate. The materials are brought to location, usually on semi-trailers, where you have different containers that hold the dry cement and any other additives that may be there. And then there's water tanks or water trucks that are on location. And then there's a mixing and pump truck on location. So that pump truck, mix truck will take the dry cement, mix it in with the water, mix it to the right consistency per the API standards. And then through that pump, they will pump it down the tubing down to the bottom as a liquid form. Generally, that cement takes 2 to 4 hours to start building a gel strength to where it can start holding itself up. After about 4 hours, depending on the cement, the depth, the temperatures, then it starts becoming fairly solid and sets up in place just like any other cement that you would see. And so that's generally how we get them. Generally, there are other methods, there's other ways to do that, but that's generally the most common practice, is to pump that down, and then you'll pull that tubing out of the cement. And so you have to pull it slowly so that you don't suck water, fluids, whatever else is in the wellbore up into that cement. And then when they're above the calculated top of that cement, they'll clean all their tubing and everything up and wash up their pump truck and get ready for they'll pull everything up to the next spot they're going to place that plug.
How does it prevent the back pressure, that first plug? Is it just by having all the equipment down there? There's so much back pressure sometimes. How do you keep it in place?
So there's a couple of things. You get the capillary effect going on inside those casings, but then also your wellbore is generally filled with some sort of fluid, water or a bentonitic mud that helps keep that in place.
Okay,
plus it's generally your cement is a heavier weight than the fluids that are in the well.
Okay, so that's in there. Okay, got it. That's very helpful. Yeah. The requirements of the cement, is that the same no matter where you're plugging the well, the first plug versus the last plug?
For BLM, it is. There are some requirements based on bottom hole temperature to add additional additives to help reduce the thermal fatigue of that concrete or that cement.
That'd be the same for the state. The only significant difference is there's cement that's designed for shallower depths, which would be lower temperatures versus deeper depths. So in a lot of cases, the same type is used, and they don't switch it up at the lower depths. So the cement that's used for the deeper depths could also be used for the shallower. But there are some occasions where different type might be used for shallow wells.
Harmony, I see that you have your hand raised.
So just a thought as we're going over this process. It would be helpful, I think, for groups to maybe get a tour of a drilling operation. Just putting that out there. The BLM or the state could try to make that arrangement. But just curious if folks would be interested in that.
Well, and for this example, I don't know that a drilling rig is as appropriate as a workover rig. Just due to the size and the equipment that's on location, that might be a better solution than a drilling rig.
Dave,
Yeah, I think most of us have seen the drilling and all of that stuff, but I've just never seen a plugging operation, actually, to be honest.
Or
Dave-
even a plug-in operation, yeah.
That would be cool. That would be super, super.
Okay, hold on. Dave, do we have something in the works in the Denver metro area as far as plugging any of the orphan wells in the near future?
Yeah, we have work going on right now. A new contract will be starting soon, so work over by east of the airport for one of the wells.
If you are, Dave, I'm going to volunteer us. If you are interested in seeing what this looks like and how it works, please send me your interest and I will work with Dave. Is that okay, Dave? We can work on an on-site visit.
Sure. Just one caveat is landowner permission. So whether or not they want a large group on their property is a potential concern, but
I actually would not need to go because I've seen this now. So if it helps to make the group smaller, I'll let you know how many people raise their hand and say they'd like to see this.
okay, thanks.
And then if you don't mind working in the background to see if we have a willing landowner, that would be great. Okay, wow, there's lots of comments in the chat. Mike Wardinsky, do you have any comments as an operator about plugging wells and cement properties and any part of this conversation that you've heard that you would like your perspective added?
I do not. I think both Dave and Matthew explained it very well for the amount of content that we've added today. So I appreciate both of them.
Thank you. Okay. I haven't looked at the chat. So is there anything in the chat that someone asked that you would like addressed? Raise your hand or speak up, please.
I'm curious about I'm curious about the amount of cement, and I know that it varies depending on the well and the depth size, but I'm just wondering, are we talking about like a small amount and it's made on site? Are we talking about a truckload? What are we talking about?
We're talking about a lot.
Yeah, so it can depend. Generally, we deal in sacks. And depending on the type of concrete you have, or the type of cement, I'm sorry, I started confusing those today. The type of cement you have, it'll fill different volumes. So it'll be brought out in these semi trucks that basically have 2 to 3 containers on them, and they're limited really by the weight of the overall vehicle that they can haul down a road to get it there. So you'll see that either on the trailer, or they'll bring out these large bins and haul the dry cement out there and fill these large bins up. So it really depends. Your general 4.5-inch casing with a 50 foot in length cement plug is probably going to run you about 5 sacks. As you start adding in 5 to 10 sacks, as you start adding in larger casings, larger hole sizes, longer lengths of that cement plug, then it increases quite a bit. As you change cements, it may change that quite a bit as well. So there's a lot of variables, but it is generally hauled out on a semi truck. One of the other things with either the large cement bin that's out there or on the containers within the cement trucks, those are pneumatically driven, where they pressurize the vessels and push that cement to the pump truck through air. So there's a large amount of it. It's not anymore. Generally, it's not just somebody out there with a pallet of cement sacks ripping them open and mixing them. It's much more bulk and efficient. I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it's more than I thought, and thanks also, Janice. So, and it is mixed on site, but it's like mixed in the truck.
It's mixed in the pump truck. So there's a bin there that has different paddles, like a much larger cement mixer that you would use at home. It's an oversimplification, but
Thank you.
Kathleen, I think I saw you jump in and have a question.
Yeah, just curious if this project is also looking at using the biochar on top of the cement pad at all? Or is that out of scope?
So
to
I have a few.
displace things like bentonite, or
What do you mean?
to displace whatever fill material you're currently using? I think you said bentonite, or maybe I'm making that up.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yes, I mean, so a few things here. This House bill is basically sponsoring two different aspects of using biochar. One is biochar as a potential aggregate in cement. The other one is as a fill in between the cement plugs, right? As a storage, basically use it as a storage. And so there you still have to have some produced water and probably drilling muds or bentonite in order to make sure that you don't change the strength of the piping, right? But yeah. And the other thing is, there's a lot of potential opportunities for using biochar, maybe in a pilot where you use the biochar outside, even the well pad, to just restore the well pad side, improve soil health, get vegetation back, right? A lot of oil and gas companies are struggling with, restoration of well pad sites, and their biochar could maybe play maybe the best role, honestly. Another thought is, our team might come to a conclusion very soon that if it's such a hassle and might not really make a big difference to use biochar as an aggregate, well, just don't do it. I mean, if it doesn't make a big difference from a carbon budget, right? Yeah. If it doesn't really impact, the carbon budget for the industry, why mess with it? Why mess with something that works, right? If for example, we can make a much bigger difference by just storing a lot of biochar in between these small plugs of cement, and maybe use it outside. And then lastly, I think Janice, she was inspired to initiate all the work towards this bill based on potential toxic emissions. And so one of the things that we were considering is, if you put biochar into the wells and mix it with mud and water, it will not work as a very good solvent necessarily for any toxic emissions. If there are any types of emissions coming out of these pipes after they've been plugged, it would make much more sense to actually have like an activated carbon filter on top of the well, and that could be in the form of biochar. But we also saw, it was the last time we had a presentation from Dan Simmerle's group showing that emissions are marginal, right? They're very small. The emissions are very, maybe, I don't know if it's insignificant, but they're not very big as long as you have a perfectly plugged well. They're actually doing a great job. It's more that when wells fail or if they're not plugged at all. So I see a lot of different potential uses for biochar as a sorbent for benzene and carcinogens outside the wellhead. And then you could replace that on a regular basis when you meet the sorption capacity, as a storage within the well, as an aggregate within biochar, as a potential way to improve soil health and restoration of well pad sites. So anyways, sorry.
Yeah, thanks for that. I got to run, but I just have a question to the group, I guess. I have a call next Monday or Tuesday with ExxonMobil. Is it okay for me to tell them what's going on here?
Of course, this is a,
Okay.
Yeah, of course.
I think they'll be very interested. And once I, do my little spiel, I'll be happy to introduce them to Tom and the team. So.
Thanks,
Yeah, we work with them on produced water treatment and reuse to Exxon and others. So
this is just FYI, a guy from Exxon that came to the Biochar Academy that I hosted, and he's now trying to get them all interested in biochar. So yeah, all right.
Great.
Thank
Thanks,
you. Very
Kathleen.
interesting.
One thing just to point out that jumping on to Thomas's conversation, I guess I would look to see if Mike has an opinion about this. When we're talking about final reclamation, it's when the state says you've met your obligations, you've plugged this well appropriately, we see revegetation, and the expectation is that you're not coming back and having to do anything more. And so if the concept of biochar as a layer on top of a well only works to continually gather or collect emissions, but then you have to come back and keep replacing it, I think it would be difficult for the state to say you've met final reclamation and we're now done with this site. So I'm not quite sure how that, and I'm not trying to throw a monkey wrench in, I'm just not quite sure how that concept works based on, trying to say this is built properly, there are no more leaks, it's plugged, now we see revegetation, we're done. So just food for thought. It's an interesting idea, but
so Karen, that would also be a failed well plugging.
Right, if it's leaking. Right. So maybe we'd be more like trying to think of the word, but like additional safety or whatever, additional knowing that if it did leak somewhere in the future, you have some sort of additional layer of protection that could potentially capture if it did start leaking. But yeah, to Dave's point, we're trying to make sure you do it right.
So
just very quickly, you're absolutely right. It would be a painful and regulatory painful process if you have to, keep oil and gas companies accountable for changing a solvent for potential emissions. Okay, so I totally agree with that. And a much better solution is potentially to have a monitor, right, that would monitor methane, for example. Not that I'm proposing that you should monitor methane at every single plot well, but I think there's better solutions and trying to just add on to what the requirements are in order to remove all the liability from these owners.
So one of the things I want to mention on that point, as Dave said, a leaking wellbore would be a failed plugging. Depending on when that fails, the solution is generally to drill up those cement plugs and replug it. We wouldn't want something else at surface that's then filtering it, because what other issues do we have downhole? And so we don't want to go back into that wellbore and replug it and stop all those leaks rather than have some sort of filter at surface.
But there's always a little bit of leaking, even from a perfectly plugged well, right? And then there's always a little bit coming out.
When you say a little bit, what do you mean by a little bit?
Well, it's a relative term, right? But it's not like there's absolutely zero emissions, right? It's an acceptable.
The goal is zero emissions.
So one of the challenges is that, to identify all these failing wells, and the only way to do that, without having a well maybe have methane emitting for a long time would be to have a methane monitor at every single well site, right? I don't think we know exactly how many failing wells we have in the United States right now. Is that a fair assumption?
I think that's a fair assumption that we don't know. The data would indicate that it's a very small number, because while we may not have methane measurements out there, there are indications at surface if it's leaking, such as vegetation growing weirdly or not growing at all in comparison to the surroundings. There may be staining that's going on there. There's other indications in which we would investigate. But generally, when that well's plugged, the emissions rate is less than a gram an hour, which is our, kind of our current detection limits that we're looking at.
Yeah.
And that's a
And that
pretty
was-
significantly small amount.
And that was one of the reasons I wanted you to hear from Stuart and the work that he did last time. And I'm sorry that I wasn't there to kind of try to set the stage, which was when wells are plugged appropriately. And when he went and looked at the plugged wells we have in Colorado, I don't think I think he found one well with minimal emissions. Otherwise, I think it was zero. There are no emissions coming from appropriately plugged wells. His other point, though, was in studies from other states with much older wells that were plugged with things like tree trunks and whatever an operator could find to shove down the well, those are inappropriately plugged and might be leaking and would have to get replugged, to Matthew's point, in an appropriate way. So I do think the point of that study was the bigger concern for Colorado is shut-in wells. We need to get those plugged because some of those, a good percentage of those are leaking.
During the one well that CSU originally reported as leaking after being plugged was an error. That was actually a different well that was not plugged yet.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so what else does the group feel they want or need to talk about? Michelle?
Thanks. I've actually worked a lot with concrete in the past. I know it's a little bit different than cement, but it informs some of my questions. One is that when you're working with concrete doesn't actually give you the strength. You really get the strength from rebar. And if you want more strength, you increase rebar, for example. And you essentially working with concrete always know that it's going to crack. And so sometimes you also do those like pre-formed seams so that you're sort of directing where it cracks. Are we dealing with that at all? And when we're talking about wells failing, is it the cracking in the cement that is that what's failing?
Short answer, no.
Yeah.
It would be an improperly set plug that would normally be leaking. You have to realize that the space that this cement's being pumped in is a matter of inches. It's not like a large concrete slab that you would see at surface that, they have to have pre-cut cracks. So it doesn't start cracking through the entire slab. So again, we are not talking about concrete. We're only talking about cement being pumped in with potentially some additives.
So I feel like this conversation was really helpful, and I feel like, thank you, Matthew. Maybe that's helping us hone in a little bit, CSU, about what we want or need to look at. Oh, sorry, lots of people are chatting things. Janice, I think, is disagreeing with Dave's comment about what we see failing when we're looking at plugging of wells, and whether or not there are cracks in concrete versus it was an insufficient plug job in the first place.
Again, not concrete, cement.
Sorry. Cement. I'm going to start a 25-cent penalty jar for anyone who says concrete, including myself. Okay. I feel like we're losing folks. So anything else that folks want to add today? Again, if anyone has a connection to Thomas, I feel like you have a connection to Anna Ade. And is it worth her talking to this group and sharing what research she's done? Because I've tried to email her on LinkedIn and on her email address and haven't heard back from her, thinking that this group might want to hear her thoughts. But I guess I defer to you since you all have already met with her.
She was, I mean, I think Holly set up a meeting with her based on my recommendation, and she was very quick to respond, and she met with us together with Mike Griffin, who's a senior scientist at Enroll that she's working for, basically. He was also there. He's also a good friend of mine, but she has been working on cement for a long time. I mean, even before going to Enroll, that was my understanding. So she has a lot of expertise. She also knows the School of Mines team. So maybe they can do something together, and they could definitely present on some of the ongoing efforts. And they're very interested in what we're doing here, and they're very interested in potentially becoming a part of a pilot if we get to a point where we do a pilot Enroll.
Yeah.
So why not? I don't know why she didn't respond to you.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm not presenting my ideas the right way. It doesn't sound maybe as exciting as having Holly reach out. So I will try again, or maybe Holly, I'll work with you and see if we can get them to visit with us and share their research and ideas so that everyone can be on the same page and have the same kind of knowledge that you all got when you met with them. So on November 30th will be our next meeting. Lori Tunstall will be there from Colorado School of Mines. Thank you, Janice. Anything else for today? All right, I'm going to work on another Zoom meeting, folks. Let's see if it works. Appreciate everyone's expertise and input, and I'll work on an agenda for next time. Everyone have a great holiday.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
You.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks all.
Bye.